It's a real pleasure to be part of this amazing conference today. So I'm going to be talking about shame and I'm going to be talking about teenagers. My research actually has been very much focused on anxiety really rather than BFRBs, but this is a really exciting opportunity and over the last year working with Claire and other people for us to take our research in a slightly different direction. And how important that is to think about teenagers in particular, because if we can get in there early, children and teenagers, in treating BFRBs, that's got to be such a crucial thing. But first of all, I must say that this research, although I am presenting it today, I cannot take credit because all the hard work has been done by Talia Meyerson. So Talia was an MSc student with myself and Claire. She's just finished her master's, gone back to the States. Couldn't persuade her to stay here, but hopefully we'll keep in good contact with her. So Talia did this research, but I'm presenting it today. So just in terms of a bit of background then, so hair pulling, as many of you may know already, starts, the mean age for it is in adolescence. So if we think about that kind of key point of sort of 13 years or so, that's for many people the point at which a BFRB might start. BFRBs, as people have already alluded to, often co-occur with a range of different mental health difficulties, but anxiety and depression are particularly common. So just over half people with BFRBs have an anxiety disorder, just under half have depression, lots of other co-occurring difficulties as well. So really important to sort of be thinking about that when we're thinking about treatments and how we might need to intervene. And so we do have some good sort of cognitive behavioural understandings, and the COMBI really kind of alluded to that. There are all these different factors that we might need to think about functionally to really understand a BFRB. But we don't really know a lot about the particular mechanisms that might explain that relationship between BFRBs and anxiety, depression and other difficulties. And shame has come up already so much. It's so clear, I think, how important it is as a potential mechanism. And there is some research with adults demonstrating that shame plays a crucial role, but we don't have any data so far with young people. So this is a really important opportunity for us to think about how shame might relate to some of those other difficulties that people experience. So what is shame? I'm sure lots of us can feel it, kind of a visceral feeling, especially when you're thinking about kind of adolescence. So it's such an intense emotion, typically self-evaluative, so where we're thinking about ourselves in a very negative way in the context of other people. Really negative and a really complex emotion. So essentially for people, it tends to occur when you feel that your social status is threatened, when you feel like you've kind of contravened some kind of rule that might be in place, whether that's that sort of social moral transgression. So of course, in some situations, that feeling of shame may be a positive thing, because if there's something you've done wrong, to be able to attend to that and then make reparations is really important. But of course, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about, a feeling that people experience that is repetitive, that is really, at an extreme level and actually doesn't reflect reality. So typically when people are feeling high levels of shame, they're feeling inferior to other people, they're feeling powerless, they feel very self-conscious. And shame is the hallmark of shame is the wanting to kind of cover it up and not tell anyone. And that really helps us, I think, understand, why BFRBs aren't talked about, because these accompanying feelings tell you that everything you need to do is to suppress it and not talk about it. Of course, this is really important if we're thinking about it in a social context, really important to think about it in adolescence. That is no coincidence that the sort of mean age is 13. At that point where you as a young person are thinking about yourself and the wider world, lots of feelings of self-consciousness, very much affected by how you think peers or other people are making sense of you. So really sort of feeling like there is a spotlight on you and everyone else is watching you at all times and evaluating you. And of course, to some extent, little bits of that are true, but that sort of feeling that, everyone is noticing everything that's going on, and also at a really important point where you're developing your identity as well. And shame can be so debilitating. So we know that it has a massive impact on how you feel about yourself as a person. We know it contributes to later mental health difficulties. It really stops people seeking help. And also when people do have treatment, there might be some instances where shame is really important to take into account. For example, if we're treating an anxiety problem by exposing that person to things they feel anxious about, but shame is an important mechanism of that, we can inadvertently do harm by not taking that into account. So it's really important that we're aware of these different potential mechanisms that might have an impact in a whole number of different ways. So this is Claire's unpublished, but it's her way of kind of making sense, a lovely model of how we might understand body-focused repetitive behaviours. This is a simplified version of it, but essentially you can see these green boxes up here, and what we're seeing here is that there might be a number of different triggers for hair pulling, and those might vary between people, or they might vary within people, so there might be different instances in which hair pulling occurs. So there are sensory, emotional, cognitive precursors to somebody pulling. And then those pulling behaviours, as the person does it, might bring particular relief and reward. So that might have a kind of soothing function, bringing those kind of temporarily positive feelings. But of course, that's then often quickly replaced by feelings of shame. And in this model, you can see how those feelings of shame might lead to further distress and further urges. So in this model, it's important to think that both shame can be a consequence of a BFRB, but it can also be potentially causal. So we're going to think about it in the context of this talk, thinking about it very much as a BFRB, and then shame being at that kind of later stage. Okay, so when we're thinking about it in this project, we've been thinking about it in context of teenagers, but trying to understand the relationship between shame and depression, BFRBs and depression, BFRBs and anxiety, but thinking about how shame might operate. So just to kind of give you an example here, we've got hair pulling, which might lead someone to have particular kind of cognitive processes. They might have thoughts such as, I can't stop myself, I'm never going to be free of this is having an impact on me and other people. And understandably, in that context, then a person might start to feel low. They might feel sad, empty, and hopeless. But shame may also come in here to help us understand the relationship between the BFRB and low mood. So actually, if after hair pulling, the person then starts to think, I should be able to control this, other people are going to notice and judge me, I'm not good enough, this is going to make me look terrible. And all of these come from different papers or different experiences people have described, then that would lead to shame, which can then lead the person to start to think, things like, I'm stupid, other people will think I'm weak, I look weird and ugly, I can't face seeing other people. And of course, that would also help us understand how somebody might then feel sad or hopeless or low. So that aspect of shame might help us better understand the relationship between hair pulling and depression. So in this study, one of the things we wanted to look at is this relationship. Firstly, hypothesizing that there's going to be a positive relationship between hair pulling and depression, but also that relationship would be mediated by the role of shame. And we were also interested to think a bit about anxiety too. So in this instance, a person might have sort of very similar beliefs as in the previous example of not being able to stop, worrying about people noticing, and then thinking people might be frustrated or angry with me. And that would be understandable, that would then lead to anxious feelings. But again, shame could be getting, part of this model. If we think about someone then thinking, I can't control it, other people are going to notice and they're going to judge me, and then feeling like they're going to be exposed, that other people are going to reject them, what if I can never get control, then we can understand how that relationship might be influenced by shame. So we had a secondary aim that we wanted to look at, which was about understanding the relationship with anxiety. So these were the methods that we used. So, we know that we're not seeing high levels in our clinical population. So we went out to the community to recruit teenagers with hair pulling. So for them to be eligible, they needed to hair pull and have difficulty controlling it. And we advertised through social media, online forums, charities and support groups. And then teenagers filled in an information sheet, looked at an information sheet, filled in a consent form, or parents gave consent if they were under the age of 16. And then they completed a number of questionnaires. So the trichotillomania scale for children, a shame measure, measures of depression, anxiety. So this shame measure is interesting. It has three different aspects to it. So one of which are kind of personal characteristics, questions like, have you felt ashamed of the sort of person you are? Some of them relate to behaviours. So do you feel ashamed when you do something wrong? And some relate to your body. Have you felt ashamed of your body or any part of it? So, right, time is flying. So in terms of the people that took part in the study, 128 young people took part, aged between 13 and 18. They were largely from the UK and from the States, but also other parts of the world. The majority were female, but also we had young people who were non-binary or male complete the survey, and around 50% were white. The other 50% were from a range of different ethnic minority backgrounds. So these are the characteristics in terms of hair pulling, and in terms of time, I guess the critical thing to tell you is that actually this group looked very much like a clinical group. It was really interesting. We'd recruited from the community, but when we look at their severity scales, they're actually on a par with what we see in different studies of clinical samples. So high level of particularly around hair pulling severity. And when we ask the young people about their pulling behaviours, you can see this lovely diagram that Talia put together. You can see a range of different locations from the body that people are pulling hair, but you can see the vast majority are pulling from multiple sites. You know, the vast majority pulling without realising, in a trance. Virtually everyone searching for hair to pull out at least some of the time. And for many young people had post-pulling rituals at least sometimes. So that might involve things like sort of rubbing the hair or the root, biting, putting it in their mouths. Around a quarter of them said at least sometimes that they ate the hair. So there is so much for us to learn about this going forward, but a real range. In terms of their clinical characteristics then, so we gave them these measures of depression, anxiety and shame, and actually interestingly you can see in the very right hand column these are the clinical cut-offs. So this group of young people were higher than the clinical cut-offs on measures of depression and anxiety, high levels of shame, and interestingly the means across those different areas of characterological, body and behavioural were pretty much on a par, so high levels across all of those three dimensions. Okay, so let me show you the results then. So this is the first one when we're looking at shame and depression. And actually in this model, what you can see is the significant relationships between hair pulling severity and depression, but you can also see that this was significantly partially mediated by shame. So shame was an important factor in understanding this relationship between the two. Anxiety was slightly different. So again, the mediation model overall was statistically significant, demonstrating a moderate effect size. And when we look at hair pulling and anxiety, they're correlated, but once you put shame into the model, that actually fully mediated the relationship between hair pulling severity and anxiety symptoms. So that's really helpful to understand that the anxiety really is about this crucial role of shame in it all. So if we're thinking about research going forward, we've got the model, that Claire put together, and there's so much more for us to really start to understand. So, we can start to look at different aspects of this to think about the mechanisms that might be important so that we can really start to develop much more targeted treatments, because if we can better pull apart the different aspects of hair pulling and then think about what's actually driving it, then we can then make our treatments much more sophisticated in what we're actually trying to do. Okay, so just to kind of finish up then, so shame seems to be really important here in us understanding what's going on. So how do we start to think about dealing with it? And I guess the first step is really about us being compassionate, towards ourselves, towards the hair pulling. We know that shame is amplified by stigma, and you could see that was in Claire's model on that very left-hand side. And some of that stigma might be perceived, some of it might be real, but that negative evaluation is so important in shame because it's this sort of social contextual sort of emotion. So affiliation, social approval and acceptance are so key in us undermining it. So actually this very experience is so shame bashing because it means that actually people are sharing experiences, they are connecting with other people in a safe environment, and that is absolutely crucial. And then thinking about trying to accept uncomfortable and difficult emotions that might be causal in understanding the hair pulling is also going to be really important. And starting to really notice those beliefs or thoughts that people have, the cognitions that might underline some of those emotions and the processes that maintain them. So it might be things like self-critical thinking or having very high standards, and starting to use kind of techniques like thinking about, when you're at your most self-critical, actually, what would you say to a friend in that situation? Because often we can be so unkind to ourselves, but when we come to advising other people, we're much more compassionate. So using that device to start to think about what would I say to a friend in this situation? Or perhaps what might a friend say to me, rather than thinking about yourself. Okay, so key takeaways. So this study is a starting point for us to start to think about the role of shame as a mediator, as a mechanism in understanding the relationship between hair pulling severity and co-occurring symptoms like anxiety and depression. And it really indicates that shame is likely to be really important here as a target in psychological treatments. It's likely, this is cross-sectional, but it's likely that, it's involved in both, as I said, a cause and a consequence, but we need much more research. This is cross-sectional, we can't establish causality, and we need more longitudinal and experimental research to really get to the heart of how this all works. Much more diverse samples, and samples including those that meet a kind of clinical threshold are going to be really important going forward. Okay, so that brings me to the end. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks to everyone that took part as well.